Hello and welcome to the She Reads Truth podcast, where we open our Bibles and talk about the beauty, goodness, and truth we find there. I'm your host, Amanda Bible Williams.
And I'm your other host, Raechel Myers. Guys, this is the last week of our Genesis study. We're closing it out. You know who's here with us. Week 2 of Kelly Minter. Amanda, this is going to be a great episode.
We loved talking with Kelly. We just all, as soon as we hit stop when we were recording, we just looked at each other and said, this was so encouraging. We love talking scripture with this woman. Can't wait for you to hear the second part of our conversation. Let's go. Kelly, you have been in this story for how long now? The story of Joseph.
Well, I've been teaching on it for at least a couple of years and then really in it, writing about it the last several months. So I don't know exactly, but it's a pretty deep dive into Genesis 37 through 50.
And you have been deep diving into the story of Joseph and writing a cookbook.
Yes, and they don't overlap at all. So just in case anybody was wondering, like, how does Joseph's story overlap with a cookbook? They don't.
Very little.
And I was having to jump back and forth between, like butternut, bisque, squash soup kind of thing, and what does the word dungeon really mean? And, what was Joseph really thrown into exactly? What kind of a pit was that?
I'm drawing a
or what kind of a prison
here.
was that?
I want to say there was a famine in Joseph's story.
Yes. And we did have a baker and a cupbearer.
There we go.
So
there's food.
There's a little bit, yes. And there was some feasting that does happen. There's a table of feasting that we'll get to, and that where some restoration and reconciliation happens.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, and this is a community-based cookbook. So thank you. You've really drawn a hard line.
You've created a collection for us.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Did you have the same editor for both?
Oh no, totally,
Okay.
completely different. Yes, and just the whole thing was different, but still the heart of God, which that is, and really truly not making light of it. There really are moments of food and the importance of food and the famine and the lots of different things that actually do play a role in this. So, but that's about it.
Well, when we do our beauty, goodness, and truth moments at the end of each podcast episode, 9 times out of 10, there's food involved.
Well,
so to say that food is close to the heart of God, I
and
feel
those
like
9
is
times
accurate.
are always me mentioning food.
What food are we talking about today, Raechel?
And is the 10th thing coffee? Because
Usually.
it's fabulous.
Or curling irons.
You never know.
Okay, so where we began here, Kelly, you have been in the story of Joseph for a long time, and I want to talk about it. This is what we're reading as a She Reads Truth community this week. We started Joseph's story last week.
Right.
Just kind of right at the tail end of the week, we read about him being sold into slavery.
Very much a cliffhanger where he's just like, okay, here I am.
Yes,
Here we
and
are.
so you're right, 37 to 50. I might have said, but we're picking up at 39.
Exactly.
And
you're right.
And it is kind of strange because there's really just one chapter on Joseph where he gets the dreams and then he's thrown in the pit and he's sold into slavery. And then there's this break with Judah and Tamar, and now we're back to Joseph. And I really think that the top is very, very important because we talked last week about the idea that when it says that Joseph had been taken to Egypt, so he left Canaan, he had been sold into slavery, he's in Pharaoh's house, there is no possible way that you can think anything other than God has lost control of Joseph's story or God has taken his hands off the wheel. It just, verse 1 of chapter 39, it's hard for anybody to think anything different than, because think about Egypt too. This is not just that he was kind of like, he got moved over from St. Louis to Oklahoma City, or he goes from the land of promise to a completely foreign land that does not serve the one true God, that is full of idolatry. So we're not even in the ballpark of how any of this could be good. And yet, look what verse 2.
I'm reading verse 1.
Oh, read verse 1. Okay, read it.
Now Joseph, this is from the ESV, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian who had bought him from the Ishmaelites, brought him down there.
He's really sold twice. He sold once to the Ishmaelites, and then he sold again to Potiphar's house. And there's nothing about this that seems hopeful. And then what does the author tell us? Verse 2.
Verse 2.
The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. Those are going to be the 5 words that carry this story.
Yeah.
And that to me, I mean, even if we stopped right there, is so comforting, because that means that somehow the Lord actually traveled with Joseph from Canaan to Egypt, that the Lord was present. And yet, isn't it so fascinating that the land of promise is, you guys can't see me, I got my hand wet. Land of promise is far north. But the presence of God is even more meaningful than the place
the
of
piece
God.
of land.
Yes, than the place. Yes.
Yeah.
And so the Lord's with him, which is amazing. And God does make him successful. And we see that the author says it twice. And I know you guys know this as you're studying your Bible, but the Lord was with him. And then verse 3, the Lord was with him. That when the author is going to tell us something twice, especially that close, he didn't just forget that he had just said it. He's repeating it because he wants us to sit up in our seats and go to everything that we think. To the circumstances say everything but this, and yet I want you to know very clearly that Jesus, or God, I should say, we're not quite to Jesus yet, that God was with him.
And it's worth noting, there's no but in there. There's not like, here's the situation, but God was with Joseph.
They're parallel.
It's a full statement.
Yes.
This was the dire circumstance, period. The Lord was with Joseph.
I love that you pointed that out.
Yeah.
There's no little conjunction there
No,
or
they're
any
both
qualifier. True. Yes, at the same time.
Right. Yeah. And then it goes straight into, Potiphar's wife.
Right. Potiphar's wife.
Potiphar's wife. And if you don't know her, you're about to get to know her when you read this week. But then I point that out because after that, she tries to seduce him. He refuses. She sets him up. He gets thrown in prison. And then verse 21. But here there is a but.
Oh, sure.
But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him.
Isn't it so fascinating, that whole section, though? Because look at the ups and downs of Joseph's life. He gets the dream. Oh, good. Okay. Then he's completely betrayed and he's sold into slavery. But then the Lord was kind to him and he exalts him up in Pharaoh's house. And then you see, then Potiphar's wife is seducing him. And we can go really quickly over this. And I don't know if you all grew up in Sunday school with like the flannel graph of like Potiphar's wife.
I had the flannel graph lady came to our elementary school.
Oh, yes, she did.
Because I grew up in East Tennessee, and we called her the Bible lady, and she had a flannel graph, and she would come to the library, and she would tell us Bible stories.
And this is one.
Public school.
I found the flannel graph. There's a digital copy of that, and so I went back and looked at it. And it's fabulous. But that's what we have in our mind.
Yeah.
But think about this. He's young. The scripture actually tells us that he's really attractive. So the author puts us in this. He's completely out there on his own. He's in a ton of pain. He's cut off from his beloved father, all of his family members. You cannot think of a more vulnerable person who could be vulnerable to an affair like this.
His mother has died.
His mother has died. That's another great point. And think about how he could have justified this. Well, and who knows if Potiphar was around. I mean, we don't know what her situation was. They could have tried to have justified this if ever there was a place where you could justify. And yet Joseph says, oh, no. I cannot sin against God. And then he runs out of the space. And I always like that too, because sometimes I think when I'm in a place of temptation, I'm like, Lord, well, if this is really wrong, then maybe an angel needs to appear, or maybe you could but it's like, no, the way out was him running away. He ran away. But what really moves me about this is that I grew up in Sunday school, and it's like, okay, if you obey, then you're blessed and things turn out, and there's this linear thing. And so you're waiting for, oh, well, he was faithful and he did the right thing and he stood up for the Lord, so he is going to be blessed. And then what does it say? He goes even lower than he's ever been. Now, not only has he gone down to Egypt, but now he's going down into this place of confinement, this prison. And this is so not Sunday school linear for me. I'm waiting for him to be blessed. And yet, and you already brought it up, verse 21, and the Lord was with him still.
God was
still
there,
there, but also and extended kindness to him, which I don't know if you all are as cynical as I am, but I'm like, Lord, if you're going to go to all the trouble to extend kindness to him, why don't you just be kind and get him out?
Yeah.
Right? Because he's in a pit or this place of confinement, and it deliberately says that the Lord showed kindness, but I'm like, Lord, that's a lot of trouble. You could just be kind and rescue him. And yet we see that suffering and blessing are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And they're existing together.
My translation, ESV, says in chapter
what does it say?
chapter 39, verse 21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love." Showed him steadfast love.
Love that. He had not left him.
Another thing that was really
In this
interesting to
place.
me in this little section, in the Potiphar's wife section, you brought it up, Kelly. You said, I would not sin against God. And I thought, that can't possibly be the language that he used. And so I went and looked. And indeed, in verse 9, he says, to Potiphar's wife, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" The interesting thing here to me is that there was no 10 commandments. There was no
Right.
"thou shalt not commit
Right.
adultery."
This is before the law.
His instinct was to honor God.
Yes.
And to be holy like God is holy. That was his, I guess. Kelly, help me understand
Well,
that.
I think that, again, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it still was after Genesis 12.
Sure.
So we still had God coming to Abraham in a very profound way, God coming to Isaac, God coming to Jacob.
Yep.
So there were still some very significant moments. There was a covenant promise, even his own birth. If he knew his own story, which I have to believe he did, was a
believe.
miracle. The Lord has taken away my disgrace. So
we wouldn't know his story if he didn't know his story.
that's a great point. So yes, you're exactly right. There was no Mosaic law at this point, but there was still covenant God. I mean, it's not like we're quite in even Noah's time.
Right.
It's
a good question to ask because you want to go like, oh, obviously he wouldn't commit adultery.
No, I love that you brought that up because you're right. He didn't have, these New Testament scriptures or even Old Testament scriptures, but there still was God's presence in a pretty distinct way.
Yes.
But you're exactly right. Like, how did he know? But he did somehow from the covenant. I really do. I think
you're right.
just that involvement of God in their place. But that steadfast love or kindness to him, that is very encouraging to me because I always just want the Lord to show me kindness and solve my problem.
Right. I want the kindness to look a specific way.
Yes.
I'd like to define this, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not always as fun when it's, hey, I'm going to keep you where you are at and I'm going to show you profound kindness. But what I take such courage from this, and I said it earlier, is that we think blessing means no suffering.
Right.
We think they are mutually exclusive, and that is not at all the case. We see the presence and blessing of God precisely in the suffering. And there is a specific type of kindness and a specific type of blessing that I think actually only happens in our suffering.
Yes.
Because the second half of that actual sentence isn't, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and got him out of prison."
No.
The second half of that sentence is, "and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison."
In the same place.
You're going to stay there.
Yes.
I'm with you.
Yes. And I believe that God was preparing him. And in fact, this passage the psalmist speaks of this, and I'd have to find it. But the psalmist looks back on Joseph's story and he gives us insight into what is going on here. And he talks about the fact that God was proving Joseph. He was testing Joseph, not in the sense of like, I'm going to give you a test and see if you pass the test, but as you are testing gold and putting it through a refiner's fire and you're purifying it. Okay, actually, we found it. It's Psalm 105, and it's verses 17 through 19. And the CSB says, "He had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with shackles. His neck was put in an iron collar until the time his prediction came true. The word of the Lord tested him." I think that prediction refers to those dreams that God had this ultimate purpose for him. But until that time, the Lord was testing him. But again, it's not that test.
Not
that,
a pass
see if you're
fail.
gonna pass fail, but this refiner's fire, this sanctifying. And Charles Spurgeon says that this was a trying word. He said there's a trying word and a delivering word. And Joseph was waiting for that delivering word, which was going to come. But he said, right now, this is the trying word. But I love this because God was still working in Joseph's life. He was purging him. He was refining him, and he was making him ready. We know, spoiler alert, he's going to be second in command.
Yeah.
So his heart has to be ready for those dreams that are about to come true. And look at how,
And even for Pharaoh's dreams that are going to come, for him to interpret those.
Oh.
He can't just do that in his own might.
no, and look at where he gets his practice. See, it says that he was assigned. This is chapter 40, verse 4. It says the captain of the guards assigned Joseph Joseph was assigned to these two people. It's the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh. So think about what's happening here. Pharaoh gets upset with the baker and the cupbearer. He throws them in the same place that Joseph is. Joseph is found favor with the Lord, so he's kind of over some of the prisoners. He gets assigned to these two. And then this always just completely blows me away. In verse 6, when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught or sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad?" And I always think, okay, Lord, when I'm sad, I don't really care who else is sad.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in a bad spot. I
Right.
mean, really bad spot. And yet he is so somehow filled with the living God that he sees these two men that are distraught and he goes, "Hey, you guys look really sad today." Why?
And also to spot sadness in prison. Like, it doesn't seem like it would be an exception.
That's true. Like everybody, right? Everybody said he saw something,
But
in
he
them
was
that,
leaning
yes,
into
that he
them.
was. And then what ends up happening? They say, "Well, yeah, we've had these really, disturbing dreams," and then at the end of verse 8, Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And we see Joseph almost acting like a priest here. It's sort of like, God can interpret this. Tell them to me, and we're going to find out, now it's going to take a few years, but we're going to find out that the fact that he ministered in his suffering and in this place is what's going to get him out. Because then it's going to be a few years later that the cupbearer says to Pharaoh, when Pharaoh has these dreams and can't find anybody, he goes, "Oh yeah, there was this Hebrew slave. There was this guy." But look forward, at verse 23 of chapter 40.
Yep.
This is after Joseph is pleading with the cupbearer, "Don't forget me.
Right.
I've done nothing wrong to be here. Please put in a good word for me.
I've been only good to you."
I've been only good to you." Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him.
So going back to chapter 39, verse 21, that says, "But the Lord showed him steadfast love and gave him favor with the keeper of the prison." So we're going like, oh, so the favor wasn't, let's get you out of here. And then in chapter 40, verse 4, they continued for some time in custody.
Yes.
Like over and over, like these time gaps of like, and then even more time passed, and then even more. And the Lord was showing steadfast love to Joseph.
The whole time, even in the forgetting.
He was forgotten.
He was forgotten, which is such an important theme, because isn't that when we feel forgotten, that is some of the most isolating of our pain, and where we can think, well, this person forgot me. I'm sure God has also forgotten me. I mean, there's just so much isolation here, and yet God has not forgotten anything. And at the very top of 41, at the end of 2 years, so here's another time gap.
So-
ESV
and we don't-
says 2 whole years.
Oh, nice.
Oh, does it?
So we don't get anything from those 2 years, except maybe, going back to the Psalm that you connected for us, Kelly.
The Lord is preparing him, testing him,
Yeah.
making him ready.
And it reminds me too of Romans 8, of like, what can separate me, even, even in the depths, you are there. Is that Romans 8?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes. Even nothing can separate us, right, from the love of God.
Right.
Neither things past or present,
come.
future. Yes. And what I love about this, and this is really important for us, is that I think for me, anyhow, sometimes when things are difficult and I'm struggling and the Lord hasn't answered a certain prayer, or I feel like he's left me in a place of discomfort, the last thing I want to do is go serve people. I can become so self-centered and so myopic, and yet it is always in the serving that is the blessing. And some of our best ministry can happen in the middle of our suffering, and we see that. Joseph was suffering, but some of his best ministry opportunity was right there to interpret these men's dreams. And then ultimately, this is what's going to get him out. And I think that's really important, because sometimes when we are in a hard place, we're especially dependent on the Lord. And that's the time that we actually do need to push out. We do need to serve. And I'm not saying that there are some times where we have to conserve and we have to pull in. But generally speaking, I think it's just really powerful here that there was this awesome ministry for Joseph in the middle of a really hard time.
It's that Esther moment of, could it be that the Lord has placed me here for such a time as this?
Yes.
But yeah.
And it's not to the exclusion of or it doesn't erase the circumstance or the place or the suffering.
Not at all.
It's an and.
Yes.
And it's for such a time as this, but I feel like sometimes we can wield that verse in such a way that overlooks or negates the circumstance.
No, you're
when
right.
it's not, like what you pointed out earlier, Raechel. It's not. It's an and. It's not. Romans 8 is lovely. The believer's triumph is one of our favorite passages. But this was Psalm 139. Where can I escape from your spirit?
Oh, okay. Yes.
7 and 8. Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. And that's what this reminds me of where Joseph was. Like he wasn't, he went to the godless land and then to the dungeon in the godless land, and he was there for at least 2 years, we can tell from the way Scripture presents it. And we don't know much about what happened in there, but we know God was with him.
Yes.
And we know that he had relationships with these men.
Yes.
Amanda, it makes me think of our second Advent episode where at the very end we read the Spurgeon sermon, the Spurgeon Christmas sermon.
Yeah, it does. It is connected.
And Spurgeon says, if I go, to the heights, to the mountain heights, I can say, Emmanuel, God with us. If I go to the depths of the sea, because I am in Christ, I can say, Emmanuel, God is with me. And that's what's happening here with Joseph. Like that description of Joseph's situation, and the Lord was with him.
The Lord was with him.
God with us.
Yes. It is God's presence that changes everything for Joseph.
It's not being separated from the Lord that changes us and brings us back to him. He is with us, even when we are not where we want to be.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to see God with him in prison and God with him in palace. Because it's 2 years later that Pharaoh, who's ruling, very powerful, and he gets these disturbing dreams that he cannot make any sense of. And who does he call? He calls all the wise men. He calls, the scientists, the magicians, everybody that typically can do this. And he can find no one that can interpret his dreams. And we see in chapter 41, verse 9, the cupbearer gets pulled in and he says, "Today I have remembered my faults." And you're like, wish you could have remembered your fault 2 years ago, right? But because Joseph was
Take
there.
your time.
Yeah,
Take
your time. But this was the timing. And he tells Pharaoh about this Hebrew. And remember, too, that the Hebrews were detestable to the Egyptians. So there's really no one lower than Joseph right now. He's a slave. He's young. He's not as young as he was, but he's young. And he's a Hebrew. So you can't really go lower. And he's a prisoner than where he is. And this has always been so meaningful to me. This is verse 15. Said, just, "I have had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said about you that you hear a dream and interpret it." Verse 16, "I am not able to," Joseph answered Pharaoh. "It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." What I love about this, though, is Pharaoh has turned to every possible resource that he has, every connection, every powerful person. He has all the money in the world. There's nothing that Pharaoh does not have access to, and yet he says, no one. Oh, but there's this guy with no status, no wealth, no power, not even from the right nation. And I get to travel to the Amazon jungle a lot and work with jungle pastors there, and they're dirt poor. Nobody knows who these men and women are that are deep in the jungle. And yet the Spirit of God is in them. And we see that later on in the chapter. Pharaoh recognizes, he said, "I've never met anybody like this, where like the Spirit of God is in this guy." And it really resonated with me when I was with these jungle pastors, because I thought, oh yeah, the world doesn't see anything about them as having anything, and yet it is so, so evident that when you are there, that the Spirit of God is in them. And then as a result, they have everything. And they have what this world needs. And we have the Spirit of God and what the world needs. And I just think that's such a stark picture, because there was nothing that Pharaoh lacked.
Yeah.
But the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
And it was going to be Joseph that was going to bring that to his way. So, of course, we know that Joseph does interpret these dreams, and you got to read about that. And he comes up with a plan, not even thinking that, anything's going to happen with his plan, but he comes up with this plan. And then that's when Pharaoh says, and this is all the way down in verse 38, where Pharaoh says, "Can we find anyone like this man, a man who has God's Spirit in him?" And then that's when Pharaoh makes him second in command. And it all happened that fast. And that's the thing, is we just don't know when that delivering word, like Spurgeon said, when is the delivering word going to come? But it came in an instant.
Yeah.
I mean, they ripped him out of that place, shaved him, gave him new clothes. And then the next minute he's got a robe, he's got the signet ring, shower. I mean, everything about his life changes.
Wow.
At that point. And you had said, Amanda, we just don't know that sanctifying process, or you talked about that. We don't really know all that happened, but somehow he had come through and it was time.
Hey guys, it's Hannah from She Reads Truth. The season of Lent is just around the corner, but thankfully it's not too late to purchase this year's collection. You've got until February 12th to order for guaranteed on-time delivery. Plus, I have good news. We are giving our podcast listeners an exclusive code for 15% off all Lent products when you use the code LENT15. Head on over to shopshereadstruth.com to order today.
And it's good that we don't know the sanctifying process. It's good that Joseph didn't know, okay, like I know that there are 30 days left.
Right,
it's
yes.
good that he wasn't like, I know the Lord's plans. God says that I know the plans, but Joseph didn't know.
Right.
And it's good that we don't know, because then our hope would be in the end.
plan.
Our hope would be in the outcome, not in the one who is with us in the valley.
Well, and the truth is that even when you reach, the end of a period in the valley, the mountain has its own challenges and its own sanctifying, processes. And the Lord tests us in other ways and refines us in other ways. And so it's not...
Which we find in Joseph's story.
Right.
Yeah. I love that you're saying
that. It is
that.
very much hills and valleys.
There's no finish line until eternity.
Right. And even he says, I love that you guys brought that up, because in chapter 41:35, when he's thinking through all of this, he says, let them gather all the excess food during these good years.
The good years.
That are coming, the good years. And I've got that circled in my Bible, because I thought, Lord, just as you want me to be faithful in the hard years, you also want me to be faithful in the good years.
Yes.
And sometimes it's harder to be faithful in the good years because that's when we don't need him as much.
Well, you're
We
not
do.
aware of your need. I mean, when you were talking about that, Kelly, about the period of, when you're in a season of suffering and you can push out and minister in different ways because you're being ministered to by the Lord in different ways. There is a freedom there it feels counterintuitive to even try to describe it, but because I'm not sure what the right language is to use, but there's a freedom in being so well acquainted with your lack that you know where your abundance comes from. Like when you're just wrung out and you don't have anything else left to give, then it's really clear who's doing the giving. Like Joseph is like, well, I can't interpret this, but God can.
Yeah. I love that, well acquainted with your lack. That's a great
And
phrase.
when you turn that up curve and you're back up on the hill, it's harder to see it.
Yes, and you're in your chariot and you're cruising across the plains,
right.
and you've got all this power in the ring and the robe, but we do see that Joseph is going to be faithful in both. And I think a lot of times we think, oh Lord, if you would just get me in the palace, I'd be so faithful to you. And it's like, no, if you're not going to be faithful in the prison, you're probably not going to be and I say that to myself. If I'm not faithful in the hard times, I'm not going to be faithful in the good times.
Well, and we see that collateral all around us in our culture, the people who aren't faithful in the palace. And that's, I mean, honestly, it's always been, Raechel and I aren't in a palace, but stewarding a ministry and platform like She Reads Truth, we were told early on and have always kept it close to heart that the thing that poses the greatest threat to our people, our community, there's not the words that we say, it's the lives that we live. Like, are we going to live consecrated lives? And that is a hard thing to do wherever you are. But I think we see that in church culture, and it's, and it's not like, yay us for being faithful. It's like this is very sobering to see people who also were once faithful fall. And to know that it really, we said it last week, I'll say it again this week, it comes back to coming back to the Word and coming back to the source and to truth.
Absolutely. And you see, it's all really about serving. Joseph is serving in the dungeon. And then when he has all of this power and wealth, he is thinking, okay, we better store up during these good years because there's going to be a time when the bad years are here and we want to be in a place to serve.
Yeah.
And the mandate never changes. And I have that good years circled because it's that same idea that you just said, Lord, anything good, my health any blessings that you've given, help me steward that for others, because our life is so short. And that is really so fulfilling to know that we're being part of God's whole plan. And isn't this amazing that, again, Joseph just could not have possibly understood what was happening. But after these good years, in fact, they said it was so good that they couldn't even count the grain.
Wow.
It's like, who has so much money that they can't even count it?
Can't even keep track.
I don't even know. I've got these bank accounts that I forgot about, But so it's so much grain that they didn't even know what to do with it. But then when the famine hits, it didn't just hit Egypt. What does it do? It hits the surrounding regions. And so what does that do? That fishes out his brothers. After all of this time, the narrator goes back to Canaan. They're the brothers, and they're still kind of lame because they're talking to Jacob, and he's like, are you going to just stand here and not do anything? And they knew that they had to go to Egypt to hope that someone would give grace for
a bailout.
Yes. And in fact, there's some important passages here that I think are worth noting. So after this is, this is verse 3 of 42. It says, so 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he thought something might happen to him. So we just paused there for a second. So there's 12 sons, as you guys depicted so beautifully in the She Reads Truth Genesis download. You see those 10 sons. There's 12. You've got one Joseph that's in Egypt. You've got 11
who
in
is
Canaan.
dead to Jacob. Totally
dead. He has no idea that he's alive, but there's no way he's sending Benjamin, because that's the last one of he only has 2 with Raechel. So he holds him back. So it's Leah's and the maidservants, 2 maidservant sons. They all go. And of course, there are a number of exchanges over these next several chapters. Brothers go back and forth. But how incredible here that God had this whole plan that he was going to bless this nation. So there was no way that Jacob's sons were all going to die in a famine. But he had to send Joseph ahead to help spare this nation. And can you imagine what it must have been like when all of a sudden Joseph sees his brothers coming for the very first time, and all of a sudden for him to go, oh, okay, so that dream that the Lord gave me, he really has been faithful. But what we know is that who Joseph really wants to see is his father.
So
that happens.
Let's talk about those dreams. So Kelly, spell out to us the dreams that he had when he was still living in Canaan, still with his brothers and with Jacob. He had a couple of dreams.
Yes, and they both essentially point to the same thing, but there's this, and the language is so funny because there's this sheaf of, who uses that term? But
Joseph.
Joseph, this sheaf of wheat, I suppose. And then the other sheaves were bowing down to him, representing his father, the brothers. And so he knows that at some point, and I'm glad you brought that up, that at some point in his life, this is going to happen. But I think at that moment when he was 17, I think he thought it was going to happen in maybe 4.5 weeks or something. Had no idea that there would be 2 decades that would pass and that he would leave. And let's not forget, Joseph leaves Canaan forever. When he gets trafficked out of the land of promise, and we'll talk about this in a minute, hopefully, only his bones go back. He never goes back. And everybody comes to him. And again, we begin to see God working out this amazing plan.
So those dreams, though, there's in chapter 37, there's the dream of the sheaves. And isn't there also the sun, moon, and stars? I quote it like I'm quoting, I was in high school. I was in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So I can only...
That is so...
I can't quote the scripture, but I can quote the song.
No, you're exactly right. And it's chapter 37, verse 9. And he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Essentially, both dreams... represent very much the same thing.
And then that doesn't come true simply metaphorically. That comes actually true. Right. They come into the palace, and they bow to him,
and they bow
not knowing who he is. But the significance, the weight of that moment is not lost on him.
No, but it's not the fulfillment of the dream here yet.
Right.
But you're right. The weight isn't lost because clearly he's like, okay, wait,
hey-o.
We're real close.
I think Joseph said hey-o.
Probably. he did, but more than likely in Hebrew.
Probably so. In Hebrew.
Yeah, of course.
How does one say hey-o in Hebrew?
I don't know. Maybe it just is universal and it transcends languages.
I like
it's just that, But he knows, wait, okay, this isn't the fulfillment of the dream because only 10 brothers are here and his father's not here, but it's close.
Yep.
Close enough where I think you go, okay, wow.
What's happening?
God's onto something. We're onto something here. This might actually be happening. And then, of course, if you go all the way to chapter 43, and you guys read about it, there's a lot of back and forth. And then sometimes it actually, people read it and they think, wow, Joseph feels mean. He feels harsh. There are different scholars with different opinions. I really believe that Joseph was acting out of grace and love, but he also had to vet, have my brothers changed?
Yeah.
Because they're coming back into his country, and he has to know, who are they now? Can I trust them? I really believe that everything he does is born out of compassion and love, because we're going to see here in a moment. I mean, he breaks down weeping when he sees Benjamin. But this is where the fulfillment of the dream comes. He really wants them to bring Benjamin. And this is, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, there is probably no spiritual significance to this, but I just can't help but notice that there's a moment that kind of kicks back to his mom here, because she does steal something and hides it.
Yes.
She steals the false gods and hides it. There's probably no spiritual significance here, but I just can't help but notice that he hides the silver cup in Benjamin's bag as if to uncover some sort of, plot. And he actually finds it, but it's the opposite. It's the opposite, because Raechel truly did steal it and was not found out.
Yes.
Benjamin,
Joseph plants that.
Right. He plants it.
He plants it.
In Benjamin's sack.
So that Benjamin will have to come back. And you know what? I'm glad you brought that.
There's probably no tie there. It's just interesting to me.
But you bring up a really good point, because when he plants that, then what happens? Benjamin comes back and they go, wait a minute, you cannot keep Benjamin, because my father is basically going to die. But we're still pre that.
But that's a moment where Joseph sees that his brothers have a newfound loyalty.
Yes, because
their character has changed.
Yes, because, okay, so now we got to skip forward then. Yes, because in chapter 44, that is when Judah, we won't read it, but all the way 18 through the end of that chapter, that's when Judah, of all people, I mean, we're talking Judah and Tamar. Judah stands up and says, wait, take me as the slave. Yeah. In fact, let me actually read that. That's chapter 44, verse 33. Now, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let him go back with his brothers. Do you see what's happening here? And then 34, for how can I go back to my father without the boy? I could not bear to see the grief that would overwhelm my father. Well, that grief surely didn't bother him 20 years ago when he, killed, quote unquote, killed Joseph, or at least told his father that and saw that grief. So we do see, I'm really glad you said that, because we see a significant change in Judah. And actually he's foreshadowing Christ here, because he's going to become the substitute. Mm-hmm. So he's saying, take me. I didn't steal the cup, but take me and punish me as though I were the one, and let Benjamin and everybody else go free. And Jesus is going to come through that tribe and that line. So we get a very clear foreshadowing of Jesus and this substitution, which is awesome. And then at that moment, that's when Joseph breaks. He can't take it anymore. And I think he knows at that moment, got it. The work has been done.
Beautiful. I'm so happy you pointed that out, Kelly, because I think that in this story, the connections we typically draw to Jesus are Joseph. Like, here are all the different ways that Jesus and Joseph are similar. But for you to draw the connection with Judah is really beautiful. I hadn't noticed that.
Well, everything really changes here for Judah. He actually, in some ways, the spotlight starts to move over just a little bit. And we get into some prophecies. I think it's in chapter 49, where Jacob is blessing all of the sons. And isn't it interesting? Verse 10, chapter Genesis 49:10, the scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belong to him. You have this real clear prophecy about this coming one, Jesus, but the scepter, the rule, is not going to depart from Judah. You would think that it would be Joseph, because of Joseph's goodness and righteousness and the way that he has suffered. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, in God's sovereignty, God chooses Judah as the tribe that he will come through.
So the full verse 10, that full prophecy or blessing is, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. I don't know. That feels pretty big. That feels like there's something happening in the line of Judah.
Yes, absolutely. And we are going to see that kind of from that moment on, I don't want to miss too much, but from that moment on where Judah says, take me, and then Joseph reveals himself, the narration does start to kind of turn a little bit, where there's a lot more focus on Judah at that point. But I do think we can't skip chapter 45, because that's when he reveals himself. And in verse 2, he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Can you imagine? Is my father, because this whole time he's been saying, is your father still alive? Is your father still alive?
Right.
Is my father still living? They could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. And I know, Amanda, you talked about earlier, just because there's blessing in the middle of suffering and evil does not mean that suffering and evil aren't in existence, or that they don't matter. He's weeping so loud that people in like other rooms and places can hear him, because you can just feel like this well of grief that just comes spilling out, and of probably hope and gratefulness and restoration and so much. And I think it's so important here, because the brothers are terrified, because they know, okay, we've been carrying around this sin all these years, and he is going to come unglued on us. But what does he say in verse 4? Please come near me. Which also has to be a picture of Christ, that they deserve the punishment, but he actually says, just please draw near to me. And then how can he even say these things? I am Joseph, your brother. And then verse 5, and now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. And there it is. It's like the parallel track of they sold him and God sent him.
And then verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God.
Right.
And and like we've said over and over again, not for just like, a month. Like this was a dramatic, this was the ultimate betrayal by his brothers. Like, what could they have done that would have been worse?
And and how much had they taken from him?
Right.
All those years of not being with his father, all those years of him not growing up in Canaan, but
his brother.
We see that not with Benjamin, and yet we see that Joseph understands something in verse 7. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And I am always so moved by that, because I believe that Joseph was able to move toward his brothers, forgive them, show them grace, bring reconciliation, because he understood that God was in control, and that God had a plan for him. And because he says, God sent me. Like, don't even give yourself that much credit, you guys. God wanted to use me to save a whole remnant of people. And he didn't say it arrogantly, but it's like he understood that he had so not been abandoned by God, that God had this for him.
It makes me wonder all of the unrecorded years of, the 2 years in prison and the
7 years
amount
of plenty.
The amount of time where we don't know, but it makes me wonder what the kindnesses that the Lord showed to Joseph, and like, how did he know God's witness,
I know.
and nearness. And because when we were having the conversation earlier about God's kindness, where it says that, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed kindness to him, and how we were talking about like to know that God is with us in those places, it makes me wonder if we underestimate the Lord's kindnesses, that if there are things that we just take as like, coincidence or just the way things are, but they're truly just heaps and heaps of the Lord's kindnesses all around us.
Yes.
But it takes us being in a place where we can see those.
Yes.
And what it would be like to have eyes to see those all the time.
Mm-hmm. I know. And we don't always have these grand moments like Joseph had, but there were so many, like you said, little kindnesses, some written down, most not.
Most not.
That lead him here.
And so here we are everybody's coming back to Egypt, and we are getting the fulfillment of the dream. We are getting Joseph's family in Egypt, and it feels, it is the last chapter of Genesis. This is the moment where Joseph says, you planned evil against me, but God meant it for good, for the survival of many people.
Yes.
And it feels great. And we see this is kind of the conclusion of Joseph's story. And then you turn the page and you look at the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8. And it says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
Right.
And the next portion of the story goes, it's not the end of the story. Right. And it feels like, okay, so the Lord preserved the people of Israel. He kept his covenant from Genesis 12.
Yes.
And I'm going to take you out away from Canaan into Egypt so that you don't die of famine.
Right.
I'm going to save you and bring you here. And then you will become slaves.
Right. But it's not even just accidental or sort of happenstance that he brings them to Egypt, because what ends up happening is they get planted in this place of Goshen, which is this incredible land. And because the Egyptians hate the Hebrews, they want them as far away as possible. And so they actually begin to, is the word proliferate into, they begin to grow into this great nation in a way that they could not have done in Canaan.
Yep.
And yet God had still promised that place to them. But here, even Jacob, and we talked last week a lot about Jacob, and really the story also falls back on Jacob. But finally, Jacob and Joseph get reunited, because we've only talked about the brothers being reunited. But finally, Jacob comes and sees Joseph. And do you know that Jacob gets to, the amount of time that he was away from Joseph, he gets to make up that same amount of time with Joseph in Egypt, which is really cool.
I don't think I realized that.
But what is so interesting is that this is such a rub and a tension for Jacob, because Jacob's even thinking, oh my goodness, how can I leave Canaan? How can it possibly be God's will that I would go to Egypt?
Probably feels like a disobedience.
Just totally.
Yeah.
I mean, we see the tension of him settling in Goshen and not even wanting to go, but then he sees that these caravans that Joseph has set, and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to die here. I mean, he really has no choice, and his sons really are the ones that get him there. But again, I bring all that up because there just couldn't have felt, nothing about this could have felt like God's will for their life.
Or tidy. Like, this is not the tidy
oh,
ending.
Goodness, not at all.
Or clear.
No.
Or clear, right. And yet
It's
God,
still the middle of the story.
Right.
And I think that's so hard to grasp, is like we are constantly in the middle of the story. We know the end of the story.
good.
It's Revelation 21. We talk about it every single episode, but we're not there. So then we must still be in the middle.
Yeah.
And so the tidy endings don't happen yet.
And yet Joseph, though, he and Jacob both, they throw their lot in with the end of the story. And both of them say on their deathbed, bring my bones.
Yep.
Make sure I'm buried in Canaan.
They know home.
Because, yes, and that signified, like, what faith? Because I think if I was Joseph, I'd go, you know what? God, you didn't stop this all those years ago, and I have lived my whole life. I've had two sons. We didn't even get to talk about Manasseh and Ephraim, and these two sons here, and he marries an Egyptian. He has his whole life. Why would he throw his lot back with but make sure my bones go back to Canaan? Because he knew God's covenant, and he knew that God was somehow going to bring all of this together. And I think that's so fascinating, because it's not until you get into Joshua that they actually bury Joseph, which means that they carry Joseph around all the 40 years in the desert. Every time,
just crazy.
that cloud or the fire would go and they'd move. It's like, okay, where's Joseph? Who's got Joseph's bones? Because they had to carry him all the way. Yeah, right. And then bury him. But there's something about him just looking forward.
It's like a final act of faith. Of
there we go. Thank you.
This is where
a final act of faith. Yeah.
This is where I'm
God is faithful.
Staking my flag, planting my flag in the ground.
I have found him faithful, and even though I will not get to see the promises, I will make sure that my bones are there, which is so interesting that is how the whole thing of Genesis, they embalmed him and they placed him in a coffin in Egypt. Happy ending, right. Genesis. But it's such a faith ending of the chapter, which
means
I love.
The site of Joseph's resurrection, the site of Jacob's resurrection will be in the promised land.
It's just,
beautiful.
That's crazy.
It's so,
I mean, not bad crazy.
It's
just
true,
crazy,
Amanda.
crazy. True crazy.
I also did just want to say that there's another really cool thing when we're talking about God in control of this story, and Jacob didn't even know that Joseph was alive. In his mind, he had been dead for a really long time. And this is in chapter 43. And he's letting Benjamin go back with the brothers, but he's very reluctant, only out of desperation. And in verse 14, Jacob says, "May God Almighty cause the man to be merciful to you so that he will release your other brother and Benjamin to you," because Simeon was being held up there. But may God cause the man to be merciful. He has no idea that the man is Joseph, but also that word merciful, that's the first time that word mercy in this way is used in Genesis. And it was just like such a cool thing that somehow Jacob is thinking, okay, I don't know what to say about this, but may the Lord Almighty make whoever that ruler is, make him show mercy. Because he knew the brothers didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
He had lived with them.
Yeah.
And he knew his own past too. And so all of this is really about the mercy of God throughout Genesis.
And that is the beauty of God's story. That it is not about our faithfulness, about our unfaithfulness, but it is about the faithfulness and the mercy of God. And what a beautiful way. You guys are about to start your last week of Genesis. And I want you guys to lean in as you read these passages. I want you to think about the things that we talked about here in this episode, but I want you to lean into what you're seeing about the Lord's faithfulness. And I want you to pay attention to the words, pay attention to the phrases that are repeated. This is the end of the beginning. This is that first book of the Bible, and everything starts here. I'm really excited for you guys to lean into this. Guys, before we close, and I hate to close this, I never want this to end because Kelly, don't tell anybody else, you are my favorite. This was so fun. That's not true. I love you.
Joseph is our favorite.
Really?
He just makes it so easy.
But I want to end on the beauty, goodness, and truth moment because it is always appropriate to identify beauty, goodness, and truth in our lives. And plus, that's just how we end our episodes. But guys, you know that when we, at the She Reads Truth podcast, we love to open the Bible and find the beauty, goodness, and truth that we find there. And we found that today. We found beauty, we found goodness, and we found truth. So, Amanda and Kelly, I want to know, of course, where you're seeing beauty, goodness, and truth in your life. And also if there's anything, because this is the end of the Genesis study.
I know.
What things do you wish that we had gotten to? Is there anything else that you just feel like, this is what I'm leaving with?
There are so many things, and it's just so hard to get all of it in because you can't get all of it in. But I just think that I just don't know how we can end without mentioning kind of this linchpin verse. This is Genesis 50. And before I read the verse, this is right when Jacob has died. The brothers are all freaked out. They think that Joseph's going to start punishing them. And it really breaks Joseph's heart because he really had forgiven them. We see that. And this is verse 19 of chapter 50. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Verse 20. "You planned evil against me, semicolon. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." There's not a but, and it's you planned evil against me. And on this side of the semicolon, God planned it for good to bring about the present result. And I think what's so important for us is that forgiveness and understanding God's will in our life determines what side of the semicolon we're going to live on.
Wow.
Are we going to live on this side where you did this evil, did this, and be bitter and unforgiving our entire lives? Or are we going to live on the other side of the semicolon and see God meant it for good? And I really believe that one of the reasons that Joseph was able to forgive and be so compassionate is because he embraced God's perspective of the situation, not man's perspective. And I know that comes off as just embrace God's perspective.
That's so good, though, and it's what we've been talking about, the struggle, but also the call as God's people to keep our eyes on him and what he's doing and not just what we can see in our present circumstances. Mm-hmm.
It's like what Paul said, I have been high and I have been brought low. And he has, obviously Paul goes on to say, I've found the secret to being content, which is that I walk with the Lord. Yeah. But even Paul found it. And Joseph found it. He was high. He was the favorite of his father. He was brought low, and he was low for a really long time. And when he was brought high again, he knew that it wasn't that he would be high forever or low again. He didn't know. But what he knew was that he knew that the Lord was faithful and the Lord was in control.
Yeah, which is awesome.
So I know I asked for beauty, goodness, and truth.
Yeah, you asked for beauty, goodness, and truth, and I gave you more scripture.
I
got too excited.
Here's the thing. Let's let that semicolon be our beauty, goodness, and truth for this week. I think that's the thing, Kelly, like for you to say which side of the semicolon are you going to live on? And I think that is there a temptation. And we see this in scripture, the temptation to look at our circumstances and sit in bitterness. And there's the opportunity to look at who God is, and that Isaiah 55, that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, his ways are higher than our ways, and sit there and go, but God meant this for good.
Yes.
All right, guys, that is the end of our Genesis study. Come back next week. We're going to be reading Philippians. We're going to be reading about joy. Y'all walk on the side of the semicolon that matters in eternity. And guys, until then, what do we say, Kelly?
Keep opening your Bibles.